Hi everyone, today we are looking at sensory perception and sensory pathways. Firstly, let us look at some important landmarks that are located on the brainstem. So on the brainstem we have midbrain, the pons and the medulla. Here I have images of the ventral and the dorsal aspect of the brainstem taken from Anatomy TV. So you might recall from your online videos that the ventral aspect of the brainstem is mostly associated with motor related pathways and signals, whereas the dorsal aspect is associated with sensory related pathways and signals. With this in mind, let us look at some of the landmarks which we can view on the ventral and the dorsal aspect of the brainstem. So firstly, we have the cerebral peduncle. Sensory peduncles is located on the ventral aspect of the midbrain. The cerebral peduncles contains corticobulbar and corticospinal tracts. Next, we have the superior and the inferior colliculus. This is located on the dorsal aspect of the midbrain. So the superior colliculus, here we have a pair of superior colliculus which is associated with receiving visual related signals. And the inferior colliculus is associated with receiving auditory signals. On the ventral aspect, you'll also see pyramids which are located on the medial aspect of the medulla. The pyramids are elevation that are caused by the decussation of corticospinal tracts. We'll do a lot more detail about the corticospinal tract when we are doing the motor pathways. On either side of the pyramids, we have small oval-shaped bodies which are known as the olives or olivary bodies. The olivary bodies basically have got connections with the motor and sensory cortex, and it also has got some important connections with the cerebellum. Here I have the image of the base of the brain and the brainstem. As you can see from the brainstem, there are cranial nerves that are emerging. There are 12 cranial nerves, but I have underlined some of the cranial nerves that are important for the sensory perception and the sensory pathways that we are interested in. One thing I like you to remember is that if a particular cranial nerve is emerging from a particular aspect of the brainstem, the cranial nerve nuclei for that cranial nerve will lie within that part of the brainstem. Let us take, for example, the facial nerve. The facial nerve emerges out through the pons, which means the cranial nerve nuclei for the facial nerve is located within the pons. Next, we have the vagus. The vagus nerve emerges out through the medulla. Therefore, the cranial nerve nuclei for the vagus will be located in the medulla. This is really important, particularly when you will be drawing pathways. You'll know that your afferent, your GSA fibers, the first order should enter into the medulla for the vagus nerve to synapse with the second order neuron in the medulla. Whereas for the facial nerve, your first order neuron will enter through the pons. Therefore, it becomes very essential for you to know from where each of these cranial nerve emerges from the brainstem. Here I have taken a table from your study manual, page 122. I have filled up some columns for you. This should be a part of your first pracs, one of the few first pracs that you would have done. This basically indicates each of the cranial nerves that we are interested in and where is it located on the brainstem, and the foramen of the skull through which it exits and its specific functions. Let's take, for example, cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. As I just said, it emerges out through the pons. Therefore, the location of the sensory nucleus is the pons. The foramen through which it exits through the cranial cavity is the stylomastoid foramen, and then it would have specific functions. Now, what is really important for you to know here is that some of these nerves are mixed nerve, which means it would have motor and sensory components to it. For example, the facial nerve. The facial nerve has got sensory, which supplies taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. It also has got motor fibers, which helps in the contraction of muscles of facial expression. Some nerves are purely sensory, such as the vestibulocochlear nerve. I will leave you to fill up this table. Please refer to this, your initial pracs that you did to complete this table. This is the schematic diagrams of the sensory pathways. So when we talk about the sensory perception of our body, which basically means our body being able to transmit sensations to our brain. For example, we have got sensation or sensory perception of discriminative touch, vibration, conscious proprioception, nociception or pain, temperature, crude touch and pressure. We also have spinocerebellar pathway, which is associated with proprioception, or muscle tone, or coordination of the limb movements. For the purpose of your pracs, we'll be looking in detail on the DCML or the dorsal medial lemniscal pathway and the spinothalamic pathway. Please use this image, which is available in your study manual, as a guide. Let us now look at the pre-prac activity. Imagine walking on sand in bare feet. Two types of receptors will be stimulated. First is the touch receptors that enables you to perceive the touch of your feet on the sand. The next perception is that you'll be able to feel that you are walking on a cold sand, and that is the thermoreceptors. These two sensation or sensory perceptions are carried by two different pathways. The pathway that conveys sensory perception of the touch is dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. The name of the pathway that conveys sensory perception of temperature is the lateral spinothalamic pathway. Based on this information, you should be now able to draw the pathway on the template that is provided to you in your study manual. Before you attempt to draw the pathway, please remember, as you are drawing an afferent or a sensory pathway, the number of neurons would be 3, first order, second order, and third order neuron. Next is the area of the spinal cord that this pathway will first travel through. Remember, the perception is coming from the lower part of the body or from the lower limb. Hence, it has to travel through the spinal cord. Therefore, you have to be mindful when you are drawing as to which part of the spinal cord does this pathway synapse and decussate. Next is The location of the synapse between the second and the third order neuron should always be in the thalamus. Finally, the location of termination of the pathway on the primary somatosensory cortex. You should refer to the sensory homunculus, where each part of the body is represented. Let us now try and draw the lateral spinothalamic pathway, which carries the sensory perception of temperature. Before we attempt to draw, let us first label all the parts of this brain and the brainstem. So this region here, you will have, first let us label right and left. Next you have the primary somatosensory cortex. Next you have the thalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla. And this is your spinal cord. You'll have the dorsal horn here and the ventral horn here. Alright, so for the lateral spinothalamic pathway, let us first draw the receptor of the temperature. So this GSA is carried through the first order neuron, which travels up through the dorsal root. Here it leaves its cell body, comes up into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and it synapses with the second order neuron. And then it decussates to the opposite side on the lateral aspect of the spinal cord, and then travels up through the brainstem. Then it will enter into the thalamus, where it will synapse with the third order neuron. Now the third order neuron is the one that carries the sensory perception to the brain, so therefore it travels to this aspect here. Now if you note at the termination of the pathway that I've drawn here is I've taken this pathway into the medial aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex. If you refer to the sensory homunculus, this is where the leg or the lower limb is represented. Hence, I've taken the pathway through this region. If the sensation was coming from the face, then I would terminate this pathway on the face region. Here is the next scenario for you. Draw a pathway that carries general sensation from the oropharynx. Before you draw the pathway, again there are a few points you'll have to remember. First is pathway that carries general sensation. So, are you going to draw a sensory pathway? If yes, then considering the information that you have from head and neck, that the sensation from the head and neck is carried via the cranial nerves, thinking about general sensation from the oropharynx is carried through the glossopharyngeal nerve. If we are talking about the glossopharyngeal nerve, the next thing is we have to consider where is the cranial nerve nuclei for the glossopharyngeal nerve located. This is the 9th cranial nerve, and it emerges out through the medulla, and therefore the cranial nerve nuclei would lie in the medulla. With this information now, let us attempt to draw a general sensation from the oropharynx. Here I have not shown you the spinal cord because the general sensation is is coming from the neck above. So this is carried through the cranial nerves, through the brainstem, and therefore there is no role of the spinal cord in this particular afferent pathways. So now we know that we are basically, our cranial nerve nuclei lies in the medulla. So let us draw a cranial nerve nuclei for the glossopharyngeal nerve in the medulla. Let us draw a receptor. We usually draw a receptor in a square shape. The GSA fibers are carried through the first order neuron, entering into the cranial nerve nucleus, where it synapses with the second order neuron and it decussates. After it decussates, it travels up. The second order travels up into the thalamus, and here it synapses with the third order neuron, and the third order neuron will terminate into the primary somatosensory cortex in the region representing the face. Now you don't have to be exactly precise, but you need to terminate it somewhere where the face is located. If you terminate this pathway in the lower limb region, it is wrong. This is an image of the head 2 section of the plastinated image. I put this image up to show you 3 cranial nerves. So here you will have the trigeminal nerve. In this region you will have the facial nerve, and then you will have the vestibulocochlear nerve. The facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve travels together through the internal auditory meatus. The vestibulocochlear nerve stays within the internal ear, whereas the facial nerve will emerge out or exit out of the cranial cavity or the skull through the stylomastoid foramen. The other thing that you can see here is, as you can see, this is the trigeminal nerve that is emerging. So the part of the brainstem that you're actually looking at in this region is basically the pons. Within your practical activities, you also have to draw these pathways. With all the information that we have provided you, try and attempt to draw this pathway of sipping a cup of coffee. So as you bring the cup to your mouth, there are again 2 types of receptors that will be activated at your bottom lip. First is the touch receptors that allow you to perceive the touch of the cup on your bottom lip. The next is the temperature that will allow you to perceive the temperature of the coffee. Remember, we will be thinking about drawing a pathway neck above, and the lips is located on the face. This 2 sensation should be carried by a cranial nerve. So think about the sensation that is carried by the cranial nerve from the face, and please attempt to draw, and we can discuss this in the class.